Hi and welcome. Today I will be talking a very relevant topic in our daily lives nowadays, which is the refugee crisis. Especially I'll be talking about the refugee crisis that is a result of the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine and long-standing Syrian civil war. I had a chance to make a short research for 1 week, which I encountered various news resources, and I have categorized these news resources into three categories, which are TV news, news articles, and social media news. I'd like to clarify what I mean by social media news. When I say social media news, I especially mean that news that are specifically made to be published in places like Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok, these social media platforms. So let's take a look into three of the resources that I've encountered in my observation. Three of them talks about relatively the same issue, which is the different attitude of discriminative attitude of European Union towards refugees from Ukraine and refugees from Middle East. In this little table, you can see the structural differences from news from different categories. For example, you see in the table that social media news contains of a 3 minutes long video. On the other hand, news articles is approximately 5 minutes reading. And three of them are relatively visually rich. They all contain interviews and various video footages. For example, news articles contains photos and figures. Other than that, you can see the characteristics of social media news in bottom left. For example, it has a distinct aspect ratio. It has a box aspect ratio, which is not conventional in places like TV news. Also, you see things like static texts on screen, which are not also common in TV news. In the second column, we see news banners and a news reporter that is reporting the news in a studio. And lastly, for news article, there isn't much to say about articles because they are in a written format. So let's now look into two more different sources, which especially talks about empathy. Our first sources tells the story of several European organizations and different Europeans who are voluntarily helping the fleeing Ukrainians. And it consists of 3 minutes news article and a 4 minutes long TV news clip. Our second source tells the story of a Syrian refugee who founded a non-profit organization, and it is a 6 minutes long TV news clip. In the first source, we see Europeans empathizing with Ukrainian refugees, and it is a great example of the empathy which is dependent on the ideology, such as nation states or European identity in this case. In our second source, we see a Syrian refugee empathizing with Ukrainian refugees, we can see that his empathy is more universal because he doesn't discriminate based on gender or ethnicity. And that's probably all I'd like to say about empathy. Lastly, I will be talking about objectivity. According to my observations, objectivity usually depended on the publishing organization, and the points of views of organizations usually depended who owns them. For example, usually these sources are either owned by a state or they're under the influence of a specific ideology. In the first column, we see two different news organizations, which one of them is funded by the European Union and the other one is owned by the German state, state of Germany. And you also see three titles of news sources. In those titles, you see stories of Europeans who are helping fleeing Ukrainians or governments building plans, sending aid to Ukrainian refugees, the things that you might want to hear or see as a European citizen. In the second column, you see one news organization who is owned by Qatar and another organization who has a progressive ideology. And in titles, you see, for example, words such as hypocritical and words that are more accusatory towards the Western world, because of their discriminative attitudes towards refugees. And in the last column, the titles are even more accusatory, and they're sometimes mock Europeans' inability to cope with this crisis. For example, you see that in one of the titles, it says media reveals major flaws in UK housing plan for Ukrainian refugees, which is these news sources are owned by Russia, and you can see that they are biased. So what do we learn today? We learned that human empathy is sometimes biased, sometimes not. And we saw that news organizations are usually biased. And lastly, war is hell and it displaces people from their homes and country. So here's are the references that I used in my presentation. And thank you for listening to me.